This is the story of a dream I'm recording. One of the most memorable and lucid dreams of my entire life. The reality is that most of the facts of this story are untrue, merely instead the products of the way the brain dissects and reinterprets small facets of our lives and repurposes them into casts of characters and circumstances that are the settings within our dreams. With the sometimes chillingly complex details resulting in dreams of somewhat bizarrely complicated layers of sophistication. What really might a dream like this even mean? What's unusual about dreams like these are how complex and detailed their storylines are. If sitting down to write a story from scratch, you'd have to think long and hard in order to develop storylines so complicated and so rich. And yet, in the span of, say, 10 to 15 minutes of dreaming, our minds are able to spin these webs seemingly in an instant. And so here goes. A number of years ago, when I was still single, I was at a crossroads in my life. Moving back to the city I grew up in, I found myself looking for a new home. I wanted a place to myself, a small place, but a place where I could support myself with the autonomy and perhaps the adultness of feeling like I lived in my own house. I eventually did find a place, a few miles from where I might otherwise have looked. A bit of a no man's land outside of the city center. I knew this area fairly well. The place was located alongside a curving two-lane road, a road that carried a fair amount of traffic, but which by this point on the outskirts of the city wasn't overly busy. You could walk across it if you wanted to. On one side were a variety of houses and small businesses. And on the other side were trees, and until you got around a bend a ways where a few small establishments started to pop up on the other side of the road as well. Along the way, there were a few small cross streets. The property I'd found was at the intersection of this main road and of one of these smaller cross streets. There, a cluster of small establishments included a mix of small houses as well as a couple of storefronts that seemed rather ambiguous, perhaps even abandoned, with only small gravel parking lots out front that were rarely occupied. The house I uncovered was a rental. It was owned by an older lady who owned a few of the buildings in the area. She was pretty busy, it seemed, with her various businesses, and so she didn't devote a lot of time to these properties, which was something I sort of appreciated, as I figured she wouldn't be getting in the way a lot. This particular property was on a stretch of the main road that was curving ever so slightly. And it created a slightly off-kilter lot where the house was located. At the corner of the main road and the side road was a small trapezoidal parking area comprised of gravel, which created a nice and easy pull-off where I could park for access to the house. The house itself was also trapezoidally shaped, jutting out a little deeper into the lot so that the narrowest end was closest to the roadway. The door was located toward the back. The house itself was but one story. And so when you came into the house, there was a small foyer, and then immediately a large living room. Past the living room was a small hallway which fed off into a couple of bedrooms on the right, if you can picture all this. Despite being one story, the ceiling was rather high in the living room, and there was a ceiling fan overhead. The lighting wasn't great, but there were a few windows that looked back out over the parking area and toward the road, and all in all, it was a decent, if fairly modest, dwelling. Over my first couple days there, I interacted with the landlord a bit. Since she owned a few of the other properties in the area, both she and I were in and out a bit. She was a frenetic person, constantly offering to do this or that, and I turned down a lot of her offers. It doesn't matter a whole lot, but one of the nearby businesses she owned was a small dental office that had a narrow and poorly lit waiting area, accessible from a door adjacent to the roadway. The existence of businesses like this so close to the main road made the road feel a bit less like a highway and a bit more like a community main street, albeit a modest one. And it made it seem like the kind of place where, with a bike or small vehicle, you could easily travel up the road a ways. This was kind of nice, and though I'm not normally much of a biker, there did happen to be a bike in the house. And I used it now and again to travel up the road to a nearby gas station, and to the Dairy Queen, which was just around the bend to the left. It gave the whole area a bit of a homey, old-fashioned neighborhood vibe. I bickered a bit with the landlord about keeping the bike in the living room, which otherwise proved to be a bit of a mess. Since I was living in my hometown, a few days after I moved in, my mom came by, alongside my cousin Tom, as well as my younger brother Patrick. To give you a picture, my mom looks about like a mom. Tom is a bit taller than me, lanky with blonde hair, while Patrick is shorter and just ever so slightly chubby, with a black, overgrown buzz cut for a haircut. We all got along okay, but it wasn't like we were the best of friends or anything. We all had slightly different personalities. They came over together, not just to help me unpack a bit, which was both nice and also a little bit overbearing, I thought, but also to help me put up our Christmas tree as it was growing close to the holiday. Now, it was a little strange to be putting up a Christmas tree in a house I was still in the process of moving into, but my mom is a bit of a glutton for both detail and chores, and so I assume the ability to haggle me a little bit about the various odds and ends of both unpacking and tree decoration, perhaps satisfied her need to constantly keep me busy, and also perhaps slightly irritated. As we sifted through the items I had brought with me, she stumbled upon a box of half-eaten chocolate-covered cherries I'd brought with me. She asked me about them. I told her that although I didn't like them, I was working my way through them and hadn't wanted to just throw them all out. She took the box and told me, in perhaps a half act of charity, half of maybe one-upmanship, that she thought she could make something out of them, and she shuffled them into her purse. Now, I should have started with this at the outset, but one of the reasons I had moved was that I had recently gotten a promotion at a new company. A fancy new job and a new outlook on my life that came with a higher salary and the ability to do some really cool things that naturally I was excited about. In which I'd hoped, of course, that my family was too. I'm the type that really doesn't like to dwell on life minutiae when I have higher order achievements in the works, and so naturally, amidst all of the mindless hassle of unpacking, it perpetually irked me ever so slightly that my mom seemed more fixated on those details rather than my bigger new life achievements. Now, this was something I was used to. Tom and Patrick knew this a bit too, and Patrick had his own frustrations with it. In fact, my mom used to belittle him even more than she did me, and sometimes it would cause him to blow up a little bit about it. Well, as they were getting ready to leave, and naturally my mom couldn't help herself, as I was walking my way toward the door, she started making some comments about the clothes I was wearing. Something about a button or something, my belt, or the way my shirt was tucked in or frayed at the bottom. It irritated me. I mean, how about a comment or two about my life achievements rather than constantly just nitpicking my appearance? For Patrick, however, it was one straw too many. And as he stepped outside the front door with my mom and me back inside the doorway, he turned back from across the gravel to face my mom, and he let out a torrent of frustrated anger that we could even hear from within the screen door, including a barrage of insults to her and comments that even I, in my frustrated state, thought perhaps were taking this all a little bit too far. I hope something happens to you and you... His words trailed off. Well, they didn't exactly trail off. I just didn't hear the end of what he was saying because, adding to the confusion of the moment, I was caught off guard and distracted by a man I didn't recognize approaching the door with something in his arms. Patrick realized this and curtailed his yelling as now my mom and I both became distracted by the sight of this guy now staring in through the door at us. He was a youngish guy, let's say in his 30s, a bit gruff looking, and clearly not the most personable seeming fellow. As we stood there, he tapped on the screen of the door that separated us. A bit odd, since we were right there. "Bobby?" he called out to me. I looked back, a bit perplexed, since Bobby, of course, wasn't my name. Again he called out, now looking at me directly in the eyes. "Bobby," he said. I stuttered at first, thinking how to react to all this, and looking over at my mom. I told the fellow there wasn't a Bobby here. Perhaps, I figured, maybe he was looking for the previous tenant, or somebody else who in the past had frequented the property. I explained to him that whoever he was looking for wasn't here, and I was instead the new tenant, though I didn't give him my name and didn't really want to. He seemed unfazed by this information, but he did drop calling out the name Bobby. As if the information I'd shared with him was indeed what he'd been expecting, and as though I'd confirmed that my name was Bobby rather than the reverse, he proceeded unfazed to inform me he'd brought me a housewarming gift. He unfurled the items in his arms, and indeed in his arms were 2 plastic bags that he handed over to me. I looked inside and sifted through the items, realizing that, in fact, in the bags were a number of odds and ends, small trinkets and small packs of Harry and David-style foods and whatnot, of the sort you'd expect in a nice little housewarming package. Now, I pretended for politeness' sake to be particularly enamored by a few of the items, before ultimately thanking him and telling him this was very nice of him. I assumed he must live in one of the adjacent houses, and perhaps that he was the landlord's son, particularly given how he'd appeared so quickly. As the guy continued to stand there, with the situation now a bit awkward, my mom decided to chime in, pulling out from behind her a small bag of trinkets in return. She handed them over to him. I was surprised she had such a thing. I immediately noticed what was in her bag and marveled at how quickly she'd managed to take the individual chocolate-covered cherries from the box I'd given her earlier, and how she had now wrapped them individually in gold aluminum foil, almost as though they were a fancy gift token. Now, I could tell from her smile that she thought this was a clever and probably creative move, and that she thought I'd feel a bit one-upped by her ingenuity. Upon receiving her gift, the guy smirked. He then quickly reached back into his own shoulder bag he had with him, and amazingly, he pulled out something that looked exactly the same. He handed it to me. A similarly wrapped gold foil-covered chocolate-covered cherry that looked identical to the ones my mom had just handed to him. What a weird situation. What made it weirder, however, was the fact that amidst all this, he didn't seem to be expressing any emotion at any of this. It was like he'd expected every step of it. Yelling out the wrong name, getting corrected by the person right in front of him, seemed not to faze him. Getting informed I was the new tenant, he was already with a gift bag. And now being gifted a return gift of hurriedly wrapped chocolate-covered cherries and realizing he was randomly prepared one for one with identically wrapped chocolate-covered cherries of his own, also seemed to elicit zero reaction from him, despite how weird it was. Not even the kind of awkward half-laugh that people give when being polite or acting surprised in gift-giving or otherwise introductory conversations with random strangers they don't know. While it was awkward, however, I assumed perhaps that the lack of surprise arose from the fact that he was related to the landlord, probably again her son, and that maybe he had mistakenly thought my name was Bobby. After exchanging the cherries, however, this guy just stood there. In fact, behind him he was now joined by what I presumed to be his girlfriend. A woman he never introduced, but who was fairly tall, with extremely pale blonde hair, and a nice enough half-smile. I wasn't sure where she came from, but in fact she did a bit to humanize what otherwise would have come off as an awkward guy to be doing a gift exchange with. Hoping to wrap up this encounter and get back to dealing with the fairly minor family drama we were previously dealing with, I made a couple of wrap-up comments to him. "Well, thanks for stopping by," I told him, hoping he'd get the message. He smirked. I figured he was getting the gist. "Yeah, okay, I'll stop by to check on you now and again, and I'll pick up some stuff," he said. It was sort of an odd statement, but one I took as plausible from someone who was the landlord's son. For a single guy, I didn't think I was the type who needed checking in on by another able-bodied guy. But I figured it was just the kind of awkward statement people make when parting ways. But after he said it, I noticed him moving to squeeze in between my mom and me. And in a moment, he sauntered his way into our house, almost as though it was his planned next destination. Due to his nonchalance of it all, I wasn't as perturbed by his movement as perhaps I should have been. It took me a second to comprehend it, but then I put the pieces together on the second half of his sentence. Picking up some stuff, he had said. I didn't assume he'd meant now, but I guess he did. I was startled enough by his move that I just kind of watched him as he walked right past my stuff, right over to a corner where a bag of the landlord's things were located. In my mind, I put the pieces together that affirmed he must somehow be associated with her. And since he was focusing on her things and, of course, ignoring mine, I quickly put out of my mind the thoughts of him being a robber or something, and assured myself that he was, in fact, harmless, likely just picking up some things that perhaps he had intended to pick up from the previous tenant, or from whoever Bobby was. if that wasn't me. As he rummaged around in the corner, my mom and I just stood there in the living room around him, just as we noticed the woman who was with him also helping herself into my house, bringing into the house with her a couple of large black vertical objects. She too made a beeline to a particular spot on the floor, though her spot was a bit away from his. In a few moments, I saw her starting to set up what looked like two pieces of mechanical equipment. With my mom and me looking at her, she got the idea she needed to explain herself. She eased the tension. These are the speakers the landlord wanted set up in here, she said. Suddenly I realized they were speakers. I didn't really need them. After all, why did I need speakers? But in my mind, I sort of rationalized it. It all seemed a little weird, yes, but it also did seem plausible, based on the landlord's other actions, that this was something the landlord lady, a bit of a scatterbrain but nice, might likely have offered to do, thinking she was being nice. And since they were heavy, she'd probably sent her son's family to go set them up for us. As the girl plugged them in, the room filled almost immediately with faint and sort of rusty record-style music coming from the speakers, a sort of creepy, almost Halloween-y tune. I chalked it up to whatever was playing on the device at the time, but it wasn't the most settling music. I didn't really have much time to think about it, however. With the guy still rummaging around in the corner, and this girl now setting up a pair of speakers, and with my mom and me in the living room, and Tom now closer to the front door, it was a lot going on. The light in the room was now growing low as it was quickly getting a bit dusky. And yet amid all of this confusion, my eyes suddenly were drawn to something else. With the glare of the lights in the windows, it was hard to see out, but my eyes were suddenly drawn to the largest of our windows in the living room, which faced out toward the gravel parking area and the street. Since I had just moved in, I didn't yet have the shades set up, and so the windows were exposed. In the window, suddenly, I noticed a face with two other small faces far behind it. The lead face was pressed up against the window, and suddenly I realized it was highly animated. It startled me. What kind of creep from outside would come right up to our house and look in? And alongside the face was an arm. For a moment I thought he was going to break through the glass, but I calmed down when I realized he wasn't. But I also realized he was waving frantically at me, almost in a gesture like a come outside motion. Fat chance. If he wanted to rob us or something, he'd better realize there are now 5 of us in here. Safety in numbers, I thought. Still, what kind of nutcase would come up to our windows like that, I wondered. How sketchy was this area? And how quickly could I get shades? My first instinct was to call the cops, to shut the front door and to make sure he couldn't come inside. Or to send Tom after him, as Tom was tall and fairly imposing. But that would be dangerous, I figured. I wasn't used to scary lunatics trying to get into my house, and so I didn't know quite what to do. I opened my mouth to alert the landlord's son what was going on outside, but nothing came out. And suddenly I paused. I quickly scanned over the guy outside, my attention darting momentarily from the two strangers in my house. And I gave the guy a once-over. He had long, darkish hair, a bit lanky. But what I noticed most was the feeling he induced inside of me. It's hard to describe. As in the feeling that, looking at him, his face seemed quite normal. There was just something about him. He seemed different than the two people inside my new house now. And in an instant, my brain somehow pieced together that it was both highly unlikely he was with the others, and that in my mind, of course, I should have assumed him to be a dangerous lunatic. But I actually somehow went through a series of mental progressions that, in an instant, suddenly told me that perhaps I should listen to him. As he looked in, somehow I felt like his face gave me a greater sense of trust and calm than the landlord's son currently in my house. I can't even say quite why. And in a moment, his frantic waving, more than worrying me about what was outside, suddenly aroused my worries just a little bit about what perhaps was going on inside. I looked over toward Tom. Tom, I realized, was looking at it too. Our gazes froze at each other. Then Tom acted first. Since he was closest to the front door, he darted outside silently. And behind the wall of the house, I assume he spoke quickly to the man outside, perhaps chasing him away. Hopefully that man wasn't violent, though I didn't hear anything. A few seconds later, Tom poked his head back in. I looked at him, and the look on his face was terrifying. I realized that he too now was waving his arms, frantically gesturing at me, a sort of rapid "come here" motion to me. And without trying to arouse too much suspicion, I gradually ambled backwards to the front door where Tom was standing. I was desperate to know what was going on. The second I got to the door, before I could speak, I realized the long-haired face guy was yanking the arms of both Tom and me, desperately forcing us to come with him. I panicked, and in a moment I remembered my mom. I wasn't sure what was going on, but thinking through the options, I figured whatever happened now, I certainly couldn't leave her alone, even if it was a bad decision. I wrestled free for a moment, the long-haired guy looking back at me, surprised and disappointed. I raced back in, now not caring how much noise I made. I grabbed my mom's attention, quickly pulled her with me, and raced back toward the front door. For once, she actually complied with my directions without question. The three of us ran with the long-haired man, sprinting across the now cold breeze of an otherwise increasingly dark night. We crossed the street, and as we did so, I wondered what was going on. Why we were running to follow a possible lunatic out of the safety of my house and into the darkness. What exactly did Tom know? Was this a decision that would cost us our lives? What could he possibly have been raving about? Was he trying to kidnap us? Would we soon realize it was the wrong decision and we were about to be raped or murdered? Indulging his lead, though, we ran across the street. Through the night, into the open door of a small cabin, brightly lit on the inside with orange light. As we did so, I noticed the long-haired man slamming the door and then peeking back through the window. He was silent. He didn't move until a few minutes later. Then I noticed the flashing din of police lights approaching on the horizon. Only then did the man turn his back to the window for a moment, finally looking at us, his eyes furrowed serious. In a quiet voice, he told us he'd been watching us. He said he knew who the man was who had come into our house, and that he wasn't quite who he said he was. He pulled out a newspaper clipping. He explained to us that he knew the guy was, in fact, the son of the landlord who owned our property. But he'd also been incarcerated and was long estranged. His first girlfriend he'd murdered. And subsequently, a few years ago, there was a family not far around the bend who all four had been slaughtered brutally, all in their own living room, in a highly curated, Satanism-inspired execution, in dark light to faint, creepy music, around a fireplace on Christmas Eve. The second the long-haired guy saw the girlfriend carrying the speakers into our house, he said he knew something wasn't right. And so he came over. And when he saw what was going on through the windows, he started waving at us. And in doing so, he probably saved our lives. After the police investigated this incident, they discovered what was in the landlord's bag in the corner. In fact, it didn't belong to the landlord herself. Inside were some knives and a series of tourniquets. When the man was rummaging around, he'd been preparing them. And as we'd been standing around, we, in fact, had been on deck, our lifespans literally counting down by the moment, as he prepared the devices he would have used to kill us in a few moments, right in front of our eyes. Prey on a platter, as this man and his girlfriend had been preparing a Satanism-style execution for us, exactly as they'd done to the other family that they'd murdered. I've long wondered what, with zero information and going against what I would have ordinarily advised myself to do in another equivalent situation, caused me to pick the confusion outside over the confusion inside in that moment. It was a decision that saved 3 lives that day, but which was largely the result of a split-second instinct. There was just something in his eyes that told me the guy outside seemed like the good guy. And what of the 2 lights behind him that never manifested as actual people? They never existed, he told me later. I've long chalked up a lot to the messaging packed within this dream. For one, when faced with a complicated situation with numerous compounding variables in which your life is on the line, trust your instincts. Sometimes, perhaps, there's something in your head that's guiding you, that's beyond your understanding. And if it's telling you what to do, follow it, even if it takes you a bit outside the box. Who was this long-haired man with the 2 imagined figures beside him? Who was it that, at the cusp of darkness, led my family away from death and the hands of Satanists, wherewith back into the light? Well, he's always been mysterious, and I'll never know quite for sure. I woke up before learning much more about him, but I'm sure glad I followed what my mind was telling me and chose his path and not the other.